Okay, so yes, the hymn we are going to begin with is hymn number 441. 441.
The hymnal's already marked to it.
Is it really? Mine is too, that's weird. How did that happen?
We have 440 for today.
Oh, so we're just going one hymn by hymn through the year.
Just like they do the Lectio continuums, we should do the hymnal.
The hymn, what would the word for that be? The Lectio continuum is where you read through a book, right? Or
Yeah, right.
you're just continuous readings.
Each week is the next part of it.
A hymniary
Right.
continuamus. Let's make up words. Okay, so yeah, 441, ride on in majesty. Would you like to get us started, Cantor? Ride on in majesty, all tribes, Hosanna cry. O Savior meek, pursue thy road, with palms and scattered garments strow. Ride on in majesty, in lowly pomp, ride on to die. O Christ, thy triumphs now begin, o'er captive death and conquered sin. Ride on in majesty, the angel armies of the sky. Look down with sad and wondering eyes to see the approaching sacrifice. Ride on in majesty, thy last and fiercest strife is nigh. The Father on his sapphire throne awaits his own anointed Son. Ride on in majesty, in lowly pomp, ride on to die. Bow thy meek head to mortal pain, then take, O God, thy power and reign. Let us pray. Almighty and everlasting God, you sent your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ, to take upon himself our flesh and to suffer death upon the cross. Mercifully grant that we may follow the example of his great humility and patience and be made partakers of his resurrection. Through the same Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Okay, so today we're hoping to finish off the book of Judges. It's been a lot of fun going through it with you, and I hope you've enjoyed it at least some percentage of as much as I've enjoyed it. Right, so, but that being said, since today's supposed to be the last class, I'm going to have Elizabeth pass out some survey things. It's a sheet with a survey. Yes, please, now. Nice, thank you. So yeah, carry around that pencil thing with you. And so it's just basically what worked and what didn't work as I was teaching. It's just for my own information. I would never do this at my own congregation, but since this is my one chance to do this, where it's not a little weird. So, but please be honest and don't worry about hurting my feelings because I don't have any. So, be constructive. It's an opportunity for me to learn and see what your perception of how the whole thing was, I guess. So. Okay, so yeah, we're going to finish up the book of Judges. So today I'm not going to do a review at the beginning like I normally do, because I'm going to save that for the end. I try to do a recap at the end or something like that. But today we're looking primarily at Judges 17 through 21. That's the last 5 chapters of the book of Judges. And
got it now.
Yeah. So I made a discovery last night that I had missed something in these last 5 books. And so, remember, I've been talking how Israel is headed towards this anarchy, how everything's going to fall apart, and Israel's just going to get worse and worse and worse until these last 5 chapters when they go horribly rotten, basically as rotten as you can get. But last night, I noticed something, and there was a spark that happened as I was reading through it, just reviewing, and I saw one verse that stuck out to me. And I looked into it, and I hadn't realized until last night that these last 5 chapters of the book of Judges take place at the beginning of the book.
What?
Yeah, I was headed this way this whole time to these last 5 chapters because it's all just crumbling and it's all just falling apart. And I'll show you when we get there how I came to that. But these last 5 chapters are actually at the beginning of the book. And so they're like an appendix. They're explaining what the situation was like as the book started. And so I had to do a lot of extra reading last night to kind of like catch up to this thing I noticed. So anyway, the last 5 chapters of Judges can be broken up into 2 parts. The first part is chapter 17 to 18, and it gives us an account of Israel. Did I just turn off? Was I really loud? Oh, I'm sorry. I wasn't shouting, I was just talking. Yeah, so okay, you can still hear me and everything. Good. Chapter 17 and 18 are an account of Israel falling into idolatry. And I thought that this was at the end, so I thought it was something that happened after Samson saved everybody, or killed all the Philistines, right? I thought that, then they fall into idolatry. No, this chapter 17 and 18 is an account of them falling into idolatry. And then chapters 19 and 21 is a different account, a different story, about how Israel had fallen into immorality and just total depravity. And it shows you how rotten they were to begin with, as opposed to where they were headed. Everything all right?
We're just trading you back.
Oh, you're laughing. You're laughing.
Don't interrupt our scaling back.
Okay. All right, so that's the idea. So chapter 17 and 18 we're going to look at first. And we meet this man named Micah. All right? And so there's this guy named Micah, and he basically admits to his mother that he had stolen some money. This is how the story starts. He admits to his mother that he had stolen some money. But he admits it, he confesses, he says, I took it. And she is proud of him for fessing up, and so she accepts the money back from him. And then she goes and takes that money and has an idol made from it. And she gives it to him. All right, so remember, this is before all these judges. This is Israel actually falling almost directly after they entered the Promised Land. This guy Micah ends up with this idol. And so it says he made a shrine, and then he made an ephod and household gods, and he ordained one of his sons who became his priest. Okay? So that's that's against the rules. Only the priests that God makes priests through Aaron can be priests. But Micah's going against God, and it's probably just ignorance, and he's not, because the way that they talk is that they think they're doing a good thing. It's like, oh, good. You were honest. Praise be to God. Let's give you an idol. So that happens, and then the tribe of Dan comes along, and they basically steal the idol. I skipped something. So I want to give an overview. I'm getting too into the details here. The point is that Micah gets this idol, and then after he anoints his son as priest, a real Levite shows up, and he makes him priest. So you end up with this Micah guy with a false idol and a wrongly appointed priest. All right, so setting up false worship in his house. But then the tribe of Dan comes along, steals those idols, and steals the priest away. So the priest goes from being a priest in a false worshiping house church thing to being over a bunch of people. Okay, and so that's basically the gist of the whole first the 17 and 18 chapters, is you have this man and his house that fall into idolatry, and then it spreads into the nation. And so, remember I said this is before everything. This is how it all came to be, where Israel strayed after entering the Promised Land. Okay? That's an overview of that. maybe hit some of the details if we can get to them in a bit. And then the second sort of appendix story, chapters 19 to 21, is a story about how, how do you say this? It's another Levite, and he sort of marries a concubine, which is like a secondary wife, but then she cheats on him and goes to she abandons him, right? But he pursues her and kind of wins her back and comes back into favor with her and her father-in-law. But then while he's traveling back to go home, they stay at a place called Gibeah, where the tribe of Benjamin surrounds the house. And if you remember the story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, how those angels came to visit Lot, and the people of Sodom came around and said, hey, give those angels to us so that we can have our way with them. Well, the same thing happens here in Israel. And the people of Benjamin demand that they give them this Levite man. But the father says, no, I won't give you the Levite man, but I'll give you my daughter and his concubine. So he throws the women outside, the concubine outside the door, and then they have their way with her for the night, and she dies because they were so rough with her. She dies at the door. And so what he does then, the Levite, this is his concubine, which it talks about her like she's a wife, so I'm not really completely clear about what concubine means, but he cuts her into 12 pieces, and then he sends her body parts to the 12 tribes of Israel to let them know what the tribe of Benjamin had done. Okay, so that's like, all points bulletin, everybody, hey, this is what happened. And so then Israel unites against the tribe of Benjamin, and they almost annihilate them. They almost completely wipe them out, till there's about 600 people left. And then at the end, but they don't want. Then they mourn over it. It's a terrible thing that happened. And with those 600 men left, they say, well, we don't want to be short a tribe. And so they kind of mourn over it, and they have compassion over the remaining people of Benjamin. And then they find them wives so that they can continue and grow back, And so that's kind of an overview of what these last 5 chapters of Judges is. And so let's kind of go start at the beginning of them and work our way through. I don't want to get bogged down too much because there's it's 5 chapters. But basically, I've told you about the beginning. So this guy, Micah, admits to his mother that he stole money, and she's happy that she admitted it. He returns the money, and she makes gods. It says she made it into a carved image and a metal image. And he turns it into a shrine and kind of sets up a little church there. And this verse 6 here is a really big theme thing in these last 5 chapters. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And if you have a Bible, flip to the very end of Judges, flip to the very last verse, and you'll see that it says the exact same thing. It says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Okay? So that's an important verse, and that's kind of where the book of Judges has been heading. Even though this stuff takes place at the beginning, that's where the telling of the story has been going, is this idea that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes, which means that there was no government, there was no way to punish sins. No sins were going unpunished. Okay? So then starting in verse 7, it says that we meet another guy. So you have Micah. He's the guy that has the false idols and sets up a priest. Now, a young man of Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, was traveling through there. And Micah sees him traveling through, and he says, where are you from? He says, I'm from Bethlehem, and I'm looking for a place. I'm looking for a place to stay. And so one thing we can learn about that is the Levites were set up by God. He said, Levites, go here. So that means that this Levite is sort of wandering around, and he's not exactly where he's supposed to be. He's sort of itinerant. He's roaming the land, and he doesn't have a place to stay. And so Micah says, well, stay with me and be my priest. be my priest. And so I'll pay you. So it's a priest for hire, right? And so he hires this priest who is a Levite. And the Levite comes, he says, okay, that sounds good. I'll be your priest. And so he stays with him. All right, that's basically all of chapter 17. It's just you meet Micah and you meet this Levite who Micah makes to be his priest. So then chapter 18, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the people of Dan was seeking for itself an inheritance to dwell in, for until then no inheritance among the tribes of Israel had fallen to them. And that's a clue that this takes place before they had finished settling in Israel. Another one I didn't catch. But in those days, so Dan, in Judges 134, it says that the Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, and they did not allow them to come into the plain. So God had appointed this place for Dan to go, but so far Dan had not managed to attain that place that had been appointed to him. And so they're looking around to find a place to dwell. And so the people of Dan sent out 5 able men into the land to explore it. And they said, go spy out the land. We're going to try to find this place. We're going to find a good place for us to take, right? And so as these spies were scouting out the area, they run into Micah and his Levite priest that he had made. And they recognized him. And they knew, hey, this is not where you were supposed to be. What are you doing here? What are you doing in this place? And the priest explains to them what he's doing there, the deal that he had set up with Micah. And they ask the priest then, this is the people of Dan, ask the priest, they say, ask God, please, that whether or not our journey and our task is going to succeed, whether or not we're going to be able to come into this land and take it. So they're asking the priest to go and ask God this. And remember, this is a priest that's sort of out of place. And the priest said to them, go in peace. The journey on which you go is under the eye of the Lord. And so the priest says, yeah, God blesses your journey. Right? Let's skip down here. And so the men are all happy. They heard what the priest said, and they're encouraged by it. And they look at the land that they're going to, and they see that it's good. It's a good land. And they also see that it's defenseless. It's sort of ripe for the picking. All right, so they go back to their where they were sent from, back to their tribe, and they say, this is a good place. It's ready to be taken. There's sitting ducks there. We can go take it. And so Dan goes out there to capture it. All right, the place is called Laish. So on the way to go take that place, they're going to the place they're going, and the spies, as they're going, say, they're passing by Micah's house again. And they say, oh, hey, by the way, in this house they have golden religious things, the ephod and the religious goods. There's some stuff that might be worth stealing there, right? And there's also a Levite priest there. And so the people said, oh, okay, on the way to conquering this land, let's stop over there and take the carved image and the ephod and the household gods and the metal image. Let's rob Micah. And so they do. They stop and they rob Micah. The priest is there watching them do this. So he's sitting in the temple thing that they had built, and these people come in to loot it. And he says, what are you doing? And they say, shh, be quiet. It's better for you to be priest. Isn't it better for you to be priest of a whole tribe than to be a priest of just one person? And so the priest's heart was glad, it says in verse 20. And that means that he sees this, oh, it's a promotion. I'm getting promoted here. I've only been priest for one guy and his little family. Now I get to be priest over a whole tribe of people. This is great. I'm going to be promoted. And so he goes with them. And he takes all the stuff with him. And so he kind of joins up with them. So after that, Micah goes and chases after those people that took him, chases after the tribe of Dan. And Micah says, hey, you took all my stuff and you took my priest. And they said, yeah? What are you going to do about it? Right? And so verse 26 says, Micah saw that they were too strong for him, and he turned and went back to his home. And then chapter 18 ends with the people of Dan took all that stuff that they took, and they set it up. Well, first they conquered the land they were going to, and then they set up they set up the idol and set up a temple. And then in verse 30, if you look at this, the people of Dan set up the carved images for themselves, the stuff that they stole. And then it says, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of the captivity of the land. So they took this priest from Micah who had been wrongly made a priest, who was being a priest with these idols and everything, bad worship, right? And so the tribe of Dan took them and set them up. And then this is telling us that from then on, Jonathan, the son of Gershom, is the name of this Levite. This is where we learn his name. And so what we find out about him here at the end of chapter 18 is that Jonathan, the son of Gershom, that Levite who was made a priest wrongly, was Moses' grandson. So that's amazing. And you don't find that out until the end. But that false worship was then set up by that tribe, and it continued on until it didn't. But it went on and on and on, and his generations were there and set up. So once you put a bad practice, it's really hard to get rid of it. Once you've changed things and got rid of something that's good, it's really hard to bring the good thing back. And there's no such thing as a temporary government program. That's kind of. I'm sorry. That was yeah.
So Jonathan was the grandson of Moses. So how did he get so far off base and was worshiping false gods?
Well, this just shows how quickly it happens. They were there for a whole generation. So he would have been. So Moses didn't get to go in, but his son his son Gershom did get to go in, but then this is like a generation after that. I think. I didn't work that out completely, but it just goes to show, and they were in this land and they were being influenced by both the Egyptians that came with them, and also also pastors' kids are kind of. Yeah, okay. So that's chapters 17 and 18. That's just a demonstration, it's an example of how Israel, who was brought into the land, stumbled and fell into idolatry. And if we look at the beginning of Judges, if I can get there very... Well, let's do that at the end, because now at chapter 19 we're going to look at, that was the idolatry, now we're going to look at the immorality. So there's a demonstration of idolatry, falling into idolatry, and now we're going to see them fall into immorality. Yeah. So chapter 19, again, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel, and a certain Levite was sojourning in the... This is a different Levite now. So don't get confused by that, because there was a Levite in that previous story, who we found out at the end was Jonathan, the grandson of Moses. Now this is a scene cut, and it goes to a different story, a different Levite. Okay? So what he does is he takes himself a concubine, which is sort of like a secondary wife. And the way it describes him in this is he is married to her. And so it says that she, in verse 2, she was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house. She goes back to her dad's house after she had been unfaithful to him. And so then after about 4 months of her being gone, this Levite goes after her to her father-in-law's house, to her father's house, his father-in-law's house. And I love this. At the end of verse 3, and she brought him into her father's house, and when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. So here the father-in-law is really excited to meet the son-in-law, even though his daughter had sort of betrayed him. And so, but the father-in-law loves this guy, and so he invites the Levite to stay with them, and they enjoy each other's company, and he stays into the night, and the father convinces the Levite to stay the night, and so he does. And then the next day, he gets up to go, and the father says, "No, please don't go. Stay longer, and let's enjoy each other's company a little bit longer." And so then it gets into the night, and he says, "No, don't go. It's late. Stay the night again." And so that kind of goes over and over a couple times. And so basically he's being delayed by his father-in-law because his father-in-law likes him and he doesn't want him to leave. And so, but then finally in verse 10 it says the man would not spend the night. Finally, enough is enough. Me and my concubine have to go. We have to get out of here. And so they go to they leave and they go to a place, it says opposite of Jebus, which is another word for Jerusalem. So they're going to Jerusalem, and he had some saddled donkeys, and he brought his concubine with him, and they get near to Jerusalem, but Jerusalem wasn't Israel's yet. It hadn't been conquered by Israel. It belonged to a people called the Jebusites. That's why it's called Jebus or Jebus. And so he says, "Oh, I don't want to stay in Jerusalem because that's not friendly. It's not ours yet, right?" And so he passes on and he goes to a place called Gibeah, and he goes to Gibeah and he looks for a place to stay, but there's nowhere for him to stay. Nobody's being hospitable to him in Gibeah. They're being very unfriendly, and so the sun goes down and he's sort of in the town square. And he sees an old man coming to him. He's in the town square because he couldn't find any place to stay. And this old man comes to him. And the old man says, where do you come from? Where do you go? Where are you going? Right? And so, the song, where do you come from? Where do you go? Something, something, Cotton Eye Joe. Yeah. Yes. So that's what the old man, that's where that song comes from. It's from Judges 19 verse 17. Yeah. And so he said to him, he tells him the story. He says, we're going from Bethlehem and we're trying to go back to go back to our home in Ephraim, and I went to Bethlehem and I'm just trying to get where I'm going, right? So the old man says, well, peace be to you, I will care for all your wants, only do not spend the night in the square. So this old man is taking them in and bringing them into his house, being hospitable to them and caring for them. And he says he washes his feet and they ate and drank, and so he serves them. But while they're in there, in verse 22, a bunch of worthless fellows surround the house, and they start pounding on the door. And they said, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And so when it says know him, it means really know him. The biblical sense of knowing. So basically they want to rape him, right? That's the idea. And so the old man defends him. He says, no, my brothers, don't act so wickedly. Don't do this, he says. Instead, please take my virgin daughter and his concubine. Right? So this is exactly how it happened in the story of Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. Almost exactly the same. And so he says, violate them and do with them what seems good to you, but don't do anything against this man. But they wouldn't listen, and so eventually he basically throws the concubine out, like throwing meat to wolves, right? And it says they abused her all night until the morning, and as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And so that happened. That wickedness. Remember, this is all happening before any of these deliverers showed up. This is what Israel quickly fell into after Joshua died and after they entered the Promised Land. Very quickly, they went to this horrible place. Okay, and so they have their way with her, and then she sort of crawls to her to the old man's doorstep and dies on the porch, just outside. And so the Levite sees this, and obviously he's distraught and upset and angry and all the appropriate emotions that would come from that. And what he does is he takes a knife and he cuts her into 12 pieces, and it says he sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. So all the different tribes get word of this horrible thing that happens, and he sends a message, and he says, such a thing, or they say, this is what they say, all who saw this said, such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak. And then in chapter 20 begins the account of how all the people of Israel gathered together and they united against these people of Gibeah who had done this horrible thing. And that's good. That's a right thing. They are right-minded. They want justice against these people that had done something wrong. And so they go to the people of Israel, they go to the people of Benjamin. The people of Gibeah were part of the people of Benjamin. It was a city in Benjamin. And so they go to the people of Benjamin and say, hey, how did this evil thing happen? And the Levite gives his account, and he says, they meant to kill me, and they violated my concubine, and now she's dead. So I took hold of her, cut her up, and sent her all across Israel, so that everybody would know. And then he said, what does he say? Behold, you people of Israel, all you, give your advice and counsel here. So he's basically calling all of Israel to action and to discuss what should be done about this. And so all the people arose as one man, saying, none of us are going to go home until we have made justice against these people of Gibeah. But what happens is the people of Benjamin will not give them up. So they said to the big tribe, say, your people in Gibeah did this thing. Give them to us so that there might be justice, right? But they wouldn't do it. Benjamin, the whole tribe, took their side instead. And so that's how it came about that this civil war broke out. Pretty much right away after they had entered the land of Israel. Okay, and so then there's a lot of details about numbers and what happens, and I don't want to get into all that. Basically, they whittle the people of Israel or the people of Benjamin down to about 600. But it is during this. Okay, well, I guess I should tell you how the battle goes a little bit. They start out by fighting against Benjamin, right? But Benjamin starts winning. All Israel is against Benjamin, and Benjamin wins the first battle. Right? And so the people of Israel go to where the Ark of the Covenant is, and they inquire of the real priest, and they say, hey, can you ask the Lord if we should keep fighting against Benjamin? And the Lord says, yes, he does. He says, yes, go fight against him. And so they do, and they go a second time, and they lose again. They lose again, and they're like, being humbled is what's happening. And so they go back to the Ark of the Covenant. Look in verse 27, it says, they go back and ask again. And it says, yes, go again. And so, a little bit of back and forth like that. And so, look at verse 27. This is my big aha moment from last night. It says, the people of Israel inquired of the Lord, for the Ark of the Covenant of God was there in those days. And then it says, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministered before it in those days. That little thing that's in parentheses is the thing that tells you that all this took place before all the judges came about. Because if you look at where Phinehas is, so here's the judges, right? This is where we left off with Samson. It's where we ended. Before him was Jephthah. Before him was Gideon. Before him was Deborah and Barak. Before him was Ehud. Before him was Othniel. But then, there's Phinehas right there. You know, the way the book of Judges is written is you might expect him to be here, you know? The stuff that's happening, you might expect all this to be going on after Samson because that's how the book is written. But no, it's right here. And so that little clue in the book of Judges that Phinehas was still the high priest is what tells you that this is that this takes place before all of the rest of the stuff that we've been talking about this whole time. Right? So they ask him one more time, shall we go out to battle against our brothers, the people of Benjamin, or shall we cease? And the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will give them into your hand. So after a couple of humbling defeats at the hands of the Benjaminites, the people of Israel now are going to go out and they're going to win and basically knock Benjamin down to being about 600 people. You might be wondering how they're asking the Lord and how he's giving them an answer. Does anybody know? This is a little trivia. No? They used to have this thing called the Urim and the Thummim, right? And it was kept inside the vest of the high priest. This is something we never hear about. But this is how they would do this. When they would go and inquire of the Lord, whether or not, they would ask him basically yes or no questions. And I don't know what it looked like, but it was like dice or lots or something like that. And that's how they would see whether or not, and God gave them this. And so it's not like you just flip a coin or whatever, but that's kind of the idea, is that God is in control of that, and that this is how he would tell them the answer to their questions. And so earlier, when they had asked that false priest in the tribe of Dan whether they were blessed, and he said yes, he didn't have the Urim and Thummim, and so he was speaking of his own authority and not from the Word of God. And so that's sort of a neat little tidbit about how they're interacting with God here, is the high priest was entrusted with this thing called the Urim and Thummim, and we don't know what it is. It's lost, just like the Ark of the Covenant is lost. But it's one of those biblical mysteries that I love to think about and then stop thinking about because I can't know anything about it. Okay. Yeah, so they wipe out Benjamin. I'm not going to get into the battle details too much because that's just going to take a long time. So jump to chapter 21. It says, so part of their being opposed to Benjamin was all the tribes had sworn that they would not allow their daughters to be given in marriage to the people of Benjamin. This is part of their being against Benjamin, right? They wanted to wipe them out, and they wanted to make sure that they couldn't procreate anymore. So they, but now Benjamin's in a tight spot, and the dust has sort of settled, and the rest of the nation of Israel is now mourning over this horrible thing that had happened. And that reminds us of how when Judas was, after he betrayed Christ, he killed himself. And then the apostles were short a guy. You want the 12 disciples, the 12 apostles, just like you want the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you're short one, that means that something is wrong. And there's not there has to be 12. So they care very much about that. It's very important. And so they arrange this deal. There's not too much to say about it. Basically, they there's two different sources that they attain wives for the men of Benjamin. One is there was a city or a place that wouldn't help with the battle, so they gave them their unmarried girls, right? And then same thing with another place called Shiloh. They would have a yearly festival, and if the women would go out and dance as part of this festival, and the men of Benjamin were allowed to go and just take them, right? And so that's kind of how they solved the people of Benjamin going extinct problem. So anyway, but that's all before stuff. That's all before what we've been talking about in this class. And so it shows how depraved and how horrible Israel had gotten almost immediately after they entered the Promised Land. And so, what effect does that have? It almost, in my mind, when I realized that this stuff comes before, it almost flipped how I was thinking about the book upside down, in a way. We've been looking a lot at the faults and the flaws and the sins of the judges. All of them except for Othniel had things that we've been calling faults and sins and things. But having this at the end of Judges, it almost makes you long for the time of those judges. You see how horrible it was beforehand and how much better it got under these judges, and how, I've been describing it as a descent into anarchy and chaos and wickedness. But now I'm seeing it starts with anarchy and chaos and wickedness, and there's a building that happens, a building up that happens. And so that spiral of sin I've been describing it as going down and down into depravity and terribleness. But with understanding that it starts like that, it makes it spiral up, and it's a staircase of deliverance instead of a spiral of sin, right? So you can look at that. Remember this? So we would talk about how it started with them being faithful, then they would fall into idols. That's what we just read about, right? And then oppression would happen, and then crying out, then the judge would be raised to deliver them. And so if you look at these different judges, it starts with Othniel, and it doesn't say much about him. He sort of sets the standard. And then we hear about Ehud, who goes in and he do you remember what Ehud was? He was the one that he was the left-handed guy that stabbed the big fat king, right? And so, I was describing, and a lot of the commentators were describing him as being sort of underhanded and sneaky and mischievous and deceiving, right? But God raised him up to kill the to kill the king of the enemy. That's good. That's a good thing, right? And so the next judge was Deborah and Barak, and we talk about Barak being a coward and you know, a wimpy man, and Deborah had to prompt him, and that's all true. You know, none of these guys are perfect, but Barak was a mighty warrior, and he conquered the armies and stuff. He didn't get the ultimate victory because of his lack of backbone to begin with. The victory went to a woman who, you know, Jael nailed the tent spike into the general's head, but through the fighting of Barak that led to that general running away and him eventually being killed, God was working deliverance for the people of Israel through mighty works, and God was working through them and delivering them. And so, you know, we always want to explain things in the kindest way and put the best construction on everything. And so, one of the hard parts of the judges is that we see all these faults in them, and we tend to want to sit in judgment over the judges, you know, and see all their faults and stuff. But God is working through them, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon them, and then they act. And so that's God acting through them. And so, and if we understand that it started off as bad and it's working for better, it's all leading towards the monarchy. It's all leading towards Israel's government being established and peace coming to the land. That's the way we're really headed in the book of Judges. It's not going down into depravity and anarchy. It's building up towards the peace that he establishes on earth with David and Solomon, right? And so after who was that? That was Deborah. After Deborah and Barak comes Gideon. And we talked about him sort of being weak in the faith and needing constant reassurance, and he's doubting and he's not sure. But God achieved victory through him, despite whatever doubts he had. And Gideon was he kind of fell into idolatry towards the end. But that's Gideon the person. Through the office of deliverer that he set up here, you know, he picked Gideon, and through Gideon he worked mighty works of deliverance for the people of Israel. And God was working directly in everything that happened in the story of Gideon. And, you know, whether Gideon, everybody has doubts and everybody has faith that needs to be strengthened. And generally Gideon was a very faithful person. He did what God told him to do, and he didn't rebel. And also I want to mention this too. Every time it gets to the end of a judge in this book, the people are faithful, which means through these deliverers, through these judges, they were also being taught to be faithful, and they were also being kept in the faith through the work of these judges. So it's not like they won this victory and then went and sat down in a corner. No, they continued to work towards keeping the people in the true faith of God. And so the way it always describes them at the end is then, well, whenever it starts a new one, it says, and then Gideon died, and the people fell away. That's kind of how the pattern goes. So while they were alive, God was working through them to keep Israel faithful. And I haven't been emphasizing that much. And this change of where it's starting from and where it's going has really kind of opened my eyes to a new way to see this book. That it's a building up and a progress toward good that God is working through these people. And so after Gideon comes Jephthah, right? Remember, he made that what we call a rash vow. He made that rash vow. But the interesting thing when you look at that is that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and then he made a vow while the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. So we can't say that was such a terrible vow that he made. You know, and he says, I will offer my daughter up. I was pretty sure that meant that he burned her up. But right now, I'm thinking that maybe he offered her, dedicated her to the temple. You know, maybe that's the better way to look at it, putting the best construction on it and explaining it in the kindest ways. That maybe, because the Hebrew word doesn't say burnt offering, it just says offering. And a lot of times it's translated as burnt offering, and rightfully so, because it's talking about sacrifices and stuff. But it doesn't have to always be, I don't think. And so I'm not 100% sure that he burned her to death, like I thought when I did the class. So after Jephthah came Samson, right? And we like to describe Samson as being, you know, out of control and an adulterer, you know, horrible, you know, I don't know. We talked about Samson last week. He's women chasing and murdering and all that stuff. But God was working through him, and God was doing that stuff. And I think there's a certain degree of imposing sinful desires and stuff onto him as we read it. And so, it sort of acts as a mirror to ourselves. And perhaps if we're seeing Samson as being a horribly fornicating adulterer, maybe that says something about us. Because the plain reading of the text, you kind of have to put that stuff in there a little bit to really see him as a bad guy. Because he's not a bad guy. Samson's a good guy. God worked through him to deliver the people from the Philistines. And that's important. And so each of these judges is building up towards where God is moving his people. And so if you look at this timeline here, it goes along there. There's Samson. While Samson is alive, there's Samuel. Samuel is also a judge, and we read about him in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's through Samuel that God finished his delivering well, maybe I shouldn't say that. But remember when Samson started, it said God began his deliverance of Israel with Samson. It didn't say Samson delivered them. It said God began to deliver them. And so, after Samson dies, Samuel takes over. And through Samuel, he anoints Saul. And then he anoints David. And so, there's not like this big drop-off and then all of a sudden they have Saul and David. It's an upward movement that the book of Judges has that I didn't even catch until like late last night. And I was so excited I woke Catherine up and she was mad at me. She's really mad at me. I pray for deliverance. Right? But yeah, and so I think that works as a good conclusion, is that as you read through the book of Judges, it sounds like things are getting worse and worse and worse. And in a sense they are too, because their idolatry got worse, and the sacrificing of babies, and there's all kinds of bad stuff that persists all the way through. But it's not until David or Saul and David defeat the Philistines. David defeated Goliath. These are the same people that Samson was starting to defeat, and it was continued through Saul and through David, and then finally they were delivered from the Philistines and they had peace like that. And that's all shadows and nothing compared to what Jesus did, because this is all a story that is telling us about what Christ does, is that we start at birth completely and utterly depraved and evil, right? But throughout our life, as God works in us through his word, he justifies us and saves us, and then continues to work sanctification in us as we get holier and holier until the last day when we are finally completely sanctified. Like when David established the reign of peace on earth that was enjoyed by Solomon. And so I love that this book of Judges, I'm a little disappointed I didn't know this at the beginning, because I probably could have taught it different. But that's the way it goes, You always see new things in the Bible, and I couldn't be more pleased that this study of the Judges has led me to see that it's an upward thing and not a downward motion, and that's a wonderfully encouraging thing. There's gospel in the book of Judges, even though it ends with, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes, which is bad, Yeah. But that's where it started, and God takes it from there. So that's what I have to say about the book of Judges. Any questions or comments before we close with the Lord's Prayer? Okay. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Let us bless the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. I've enjoyed this.